It was 2012, and my best friend Hannah had convinced me to join her on a weekend trip up north. She had, after searching for the longest time, found her dream car and was planning on travelling the 900 kilometres to the very north of Sweden to buy it. It was a second-hand, two-door Suzuki Vitara in a purplish kind of colour, and I must admit, I didn't share her obsession with it, but, with her being the closest thing to a sister that I will ever get, I was happy to join her nonetheless. Hannah and I have always had each other, from the cradle and onwards. Sharing each other's love for adventure, we have travelled the world together. At the time this happened, we were both 21, and had recently returned from a trip in Asia. The man who was selling her the car had agreed to meet us at the small airport in Umeå. When we arrived shortly before lunchtime, it had started to snow heavily. The first snow of the season, no less. The parking lot was almost empty, and when I saw the man standing outside the Vitara, I felt immediately concerned. He was dressed like a hunter. A lot of people in this area of the country live a lifestyle with hunting and fishing, so nothing strange with that really. But still, there was something about him that made me uneasy. He was nice though, smiling and waving to us, shaking hands with us both before walking us around the car and pointing out all the tiny little flaws. He showed us the work he had done to the car, and showed the paperwork from the recently done engine repairs. He made the impression that he didn't want to hide anything. On the contrary, he made a show out of being very forthcoming and honest. The snowing had now intensified, and we were getting cold. He opened the car door for us and said, "I got the paperwork at home. Let's close the deal over some coffee." Against all my instincts, I climbed in after Hannah, both of us now trapped in the back seat. I had no reason to feel threatened by this man, who had been nothing but pleasant to us. Other than the alarm bells going off inside my head, I couldn't tell what it was that made me feel this way. But there must have been some sign that something was wrong. Something that my subconscious tuned into. The man was constantly talking. Funny, since people from the north of Scandinavia are famous for never speaking a word more than absolutely necessary. He showed the stereo, told us about the features of the car, about the places we drove past, and about the wildlife and the nature. There was not a silent moment. After about 20 minutes, I started to notice that we were in no way moving in the direction of civilization. Instead, it seemed we were driving further and further into the vast wilderness. It struck me that he had us in the back of a two-door car, driving us into unknown territory, and no one knew where we were. I looked at Hannah, who was happily listening to the man telling stories about the area, and I noticed she didn't look at all worried. Maybe I was totally overreacting. We drove past a group of people standing by the side of the road. Hunters, planning their day, or taking a break maybe. This truly is a very different Sweden compared to the city. The car finally stopped outside a small, wooden cottage with no neighbouring houses, apart from a small cabin that we drove past a few hundred metres down the road, but it had looked empty. We followed the man inside. He was still talking non-stop, and continued to do so until the moment the door closed behind us. Hannah kept asking things about the car, and I could sense that her voice had a new undertone now. A thin, sharp tenseness that made me wonder if she too had started to feel that something wasn't right. "I'll put the kettle on," he said, and as he passed us to go into the kitchen, he let his hand touch Hannah's hair and he smiled smugly. "May I use the bathroom?" I asked politely, and made my way to the door with the little red heart on. I was washing my hands when I saw something in the stained bathroom mirror. Something was hidden behind the water cistern. I pulled out a rolled up plastic folder, and as I turned the pages, I felt my blood run cold. It was very violent porn pictures that looked like they had been cut out from magazines, and they were glued to the paper, surrounded by cut out pieces of handwritten text. Put together, it made a horrifying story about how a woman was lured into a car with the promise of getting the car cheap, and then it quickly turned into a horror story. I know this will sound silly, but when we travelled together, Hannah and I had a code word for whenever we felt like it was time to get out of a situation. We had never needed to use it, just joked about it, but now it came in handy. I walked out of the bathroom and looked at Hannah and said, "Potatoes. We forgot to buy potatoes, and that's too bad, because good God do we need some." The look on my face must have told her that the situation was no joke, and she said, "Oh, should we get some as soon as possible?" "The sooner the better," I replied. Hannah, always pretty charming and capable of great acting, casually walked over to the man in the kitchen, tapped his shoulder, and said, "Excuse me, but I was wondering if I can have a quick look at the cam belt." He huffed something about it being in good shape and handed over the keys. We got in the car and sped off faster than the weather strictly speaking allowed. We left the car at the airport and hoped we hadn't made a terrible mistake. What if he reported it stolen? It would be pretty embarrassing to explain to the police. But nothing happened. He didn't follow us, didn't report it in. We had to take the train since we had no plane tickets. The original plan had been to take the car home, and we didn't want to linger close to the airport in case he came looking for us. Later, Hannah asked me what made me use the code word, and I told her about what I had found. It might just have been a fantasy, a sick game, and maybe he would never have done anything to us. But right then and there, I was convinced we would die if we didn't get out. Thank God Hannah didn't need any convincing or proof, just the code word. I truly think that if we hadn't talked about it so many times before, about how we would handle a situation where we need to get out fast, things would have ended differently. Both of us knew that if either of us ever used the code word, it's time to get out. No questions asked, just move. This isn't my own encounter, but my mother's experience from when she was around 19 to 21 years old. My mother was almost a victim of a creepy, rapist, serial killer who preferably uses axes as a signature weapon. She lived alone in a small unit in Richmond and worked night shifts at a restaurant. Because she worked nights, she would sleep during the day and wake up around 2 to 3 p.m. She had a friend who visited her place regularly around the time she woke up, and they would eat a meal together and hang out for a couple of hours. This was a part of my mum's daily routine. One night, my mum was at the laundromat alone, and she noticed a smallish young European or Middle Eastern macho-looking man unloading a washing machine full of baby clothes. To my mum, the whole scene looked out of place. The guy didn't seem right. His demeanour didn't fit the load of baby clothing he was hauling into the basket. The man looked over at my mum and stared at her, but my mum mentioned that she didn't think much of it at the time. She left shortly after with her load and drove back to her unit. A couple of weeks later, my mum finished her shift at work and drove back to her place, went to bed, and woke up the next day, in the afternoon, and heard a knock at her front door. Assuming it was her friend, she started walking down the hallway, where you could see a frosted window at the end. She saw a smallish figure, the exact size as her friend, and didn't have any thought that it could be someone other than who she expected. My mum said that when she was halfway down the hallway, her body suddenly stopped in its tracks, and an immediate, overwhelming feeling of crippling fear came over her. She was frozen, and staring at the shape of the figure outside for a minute, when an unknown voice said something like, "Hey, come open the door. It's me." My mum slowly walked down the hallway and into a bedroom. She waited in her room for the unknown visitor to leave, but he didn't. Every couple of minutes, he would say things like, "Come on, let me in. I know you're in there. Why don't you open the door?" According to my mum, she waited in her room for maybe 2 hours, listening to the stranger call out to her. She couldn't call anyone because the phone was in her kitchen, and she didn't have the bravery to leave her room, as the unit was tiny and easily accessible. She was afraid the person outside would hear her and find a way to get inside. She mentioned that after waiting for so long, she couldn't handle the cold temperature of her room, as she was barely wearing anything. She finally got the guts to jump up and bolt from her room to the kitchen, which had a back door. She ran out the back door and down the street behind her unit. She had a neighbour who she was friends with and went straight to their place. She explained what happened, and they both looked out this person's window, which had a view of my mum's unit since their street was in a U-shape. They could see the stranger still standing at the front of my mum's door. It was the same man from the laundromat a few weeks earlier. They called the police, but the man left before anyone came. After the incident, my mum stayed at her parents' house for a few days. Soon, she felt that she was safe to go live in her own unit again. A couple of weeks after moving back to her unit, she begins receiving notes under her door and on her front steps. According to my mum, the letters had strange things written on them. She never told me what was written, but she mentioned that the sentences and the words were extremely amateur, as if written by a 6-year-old. The letters were squiggly, written back to front, and arranged in strange sequences. My mum would give the notes into the police station. They weren't treated as much of a threat, but this continued for maybe a few weeks or a month. One day, my mum woke up in the afternoon after a previous night shift. It was just another regular day, but she felt that she needed to go and spend a night at her parents' house. She left, spent the night, and got a call the next day to find the strange man from the first incident had returned to her unit around the same time she left, made his way to the back of her unit with an axe, and immediately started axing down the back door like a madman. He was seen by a neighbour who called the police. However, the man again left before the police came. It turned out that the man's description, partnered with the strange notes my mum was receiving, fit the policeman's belief that the man was a suspect of the rape and the murders of a number of girls in Melbourne from the 70s and onwards. He wasn't caught, and I don't know if he ever was. He's most likely still out there. This happened a couple of years ago, back when I was a dancer at a gentleman's club in Virginia. It was the most upscale place in the city, but it still more or less catered to a regular clientele. There was a man named George who used to come in to see me a couple times a week. He'd buy dances and VIP rooms and always tip me really well, while saying things like, "I can't believe you don't have a boyfriend," and "When are you going to let me take you out to dinner?" The thing is, I did have a boyfriend. However, much like my real name, my personal life is not anyone's business, and strip clubs are a fantasy environment. If these men knew that I had a boyfriend and life outside of dancing for them, I probably wouldn't have made as much money as I did. One night, I was getting dressed to leave, and I was excited to get home as my boyfriend had just come back from the tour he was on and was waiting for me at home. The club closed at 2 AM, so I was usually walking out of the door and to my car around 2:30 AM. Usually, we have a bouncer walk us out, but since it was a slow night, we only had one bouncer still on the clock, and he was off doing something else. I was in a hurry, so I just ran to my car alone. As soon as I started my car and turned out of the parking lot, another car turned its lights on and pulled out behind me. I didn't think too much of it and continued on my way home, until I realized that every turn I made, the car also made. He followed me onto the highway and then onto my exit. My boyfriend and I lived on the outskirts of the city in a heavily wooded area where houses are pretty few and far between. So, as soon as the car took the same exit onto the gravel road that leads to the area my house is in, I called my boyfriend. Now, my boyfriend at the time was a really big guy, and he had a really bad temper. As soon as I pulled into our drive, he ran out behind his tour van with a baseball bat and two of our dogs following close behind. He had told me to stay in the car, so I was trying to see who was following me without actually getting out. And of course, it was George. My boyfriend managed to hit the hood of his car with the bat before George could reverse down the gravel road and disappear. I was scared because he knew where I lived now, but my boyfriend assured me that there was nothing to worry about anymore, and he had most likely deterred George from ever coming back. I told the managers at work about the incident the next day, and they banned George from the club. A couple months later, he had tried to come in, but the bouncers had stopped him, and his only explanation was, "I thought she didn't have a boyfriend."